On a crisp November evening in 1978, the Morrison family gathered around their dining table in suburban Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., completely unaware that their routine Sunday dinner was about to unravel a Soviet intelligence operation that had been running successfully for nearly 2 decades. The aroma of pot roast filled their modest split-level home, and conversation flowed as easily as the wine their father poured, each family member believing they knew exactly who they were and where they came from. What none of them suspected was that a single, seemingly innocent question about their grandmother's maiden name would expose a web of lies so intricate that it would ultimately lead FBI counterintelligence agents to one of the most successful Soviet illegals ever to operate on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Walter Morrison sat at the head of the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he carved the roast with practiced precision. At 53 years old, he was the picture of American middle-class success. He worked as a mid-level analyst at the State Department, a position he had held for 18 years after emigrating from Austria in 1959. His accent had faded to barely a trace, just enough to give his English a cultured edge that colleagues found distinguished rather than foreign. His wife, Margaret, sat opposite him, her auburn hair showing threads of silver, her face bearing the gentle lines of a woman who smiled often and worried rarely. Their son, David, 22 years old and fresh from completing his degree in international relations at Georgetown University, sat beside his younger sister Amy, who at 19 was in her sophomore year at the University of Virginia. The family had gathered to celebrate Amy's birthday, though the real celebration had been the previous day. Sunday dinners were sacred in the Morrison household, a tradition Walter had insisted upon since the children were small. David reached for the mashed potatoes, his movements easy and relaxed in the comfortable familiarity of home. He had recently received a promising job offer from a think tank that specialized in Soviet affairs, and the conversation had naturally drifted toward his upcoming career. "So, they want you to start in January," Margaret said, passing the green beans to Amy. "That gives you the whole holiday season to relax before diving in." David nodded, accepting the bowl from his sister. "The position sounds incredible. I will be working directly with former State Department officials, analyzing Soviet policy documents. It is exactly what I have been hoping for." Walter looked up from his plate, pride evident in his expression. "Your education has prepared you well for this. Understanding the Soviet system, their methods of thinking, it requires a particular kind of analytical mind." Amy swirled her wine glass, watching the burgundy liquid catch the light from the chandelier above. "Speaking of understanding Soviet systems," she said with the casual curiosity of someone making conversation, "we had this genealogy assignment in my history class. We are supposed to trace our family trees back at least 4 generations. I realized I do not know much about our Austrian relatives." Walter continued cutting his meat, his movements steady. "What would you like to know?" "Well," Amy said, leaning forward with genuine interest, "I know grandmother's name was Helene, but what was her maiden name? And where exactly in Austria did she live?" The professor wants specific details, actual documentation if possible, for just a fraction of a second, so brief that only someone watching specifically for it would have noticed. Walter's knife hesitated against the plate. Then he continued eating, his voice calm and measured. "Her maiden name was Kohler. She came from a small village outside Vienna. Most of the records were destroyed during the war. David had been reaching for his water glass when his father spoke, and something in the moment made him pause. He had heard his father discuss his Austrian background countless times over the years, always with the same general details, the same vague references to war losses and destroyed records. But this time, hearing it in response to Amy's specific question, something felt different. He could not articulate what exactly troubled him, but a small seed of unease planted itself in his mind. "Which village?" Amy pressed, oblivious to any tension. "Even small villages have names. I can probably find something in the university archives or contact Austrian records offices." Margaret intervened smoothly, her tone light. Your father has told you, sweetheart, so many records from that period are simply gone. The war was devastating to that part of Europe. Why don't you focus on my side of the family? My grandmother kept excellent records, and I have photographs going back to the 1880s. But that is only half my heritage, Amy protested, though without any real stubbornness. I want to know about both sides. Walter set down his silverware and met his daughter's eyes with a gentle smile. The village was called Kirchberg, very small, barely 200 people. My mother moved to Vienna before the war to work as a seamstress. That is where she met my father. They married in 1937. I was born in 1945, just after the war ended. We came to America when I was 14. It was not an easy journey, and many documents were lost along the way. These things happen in wartime, Amy. Millions of families have these gaps in their histories. The explanation was detailed, specific, delivered with just the right mixture of sadness and matter-of-factness. Amy nodded, satisfied, and the conversation moved on to lighter topics. David watched his father throughout the rest of dinner, bothered by something he could not name. His training in international relations had taught him to pay attention to patterns, to inconsistencies, to the small details that did not quite align. And something about his father's response had triggered that analytical part of his mind. Later that evening, after Amy had left to return to university and Margaret had gone upstairs to read, David found himself alone in his father's study. He told himself he was looking for a book on Soviet history his father had promised to lend him, but his hands moved instead to the filing cabinet where his father kept family documents. The drawer was unlocked, a fact that itself seemed somehow significant. If someone had secrets to hide, would they not lock them away? Inside, he found the expected materials: birth certificates, naturalization papers, tax documents organized with typical Austrian precision. David pulled out his father's naturalization file, dated 1965. The paperwork seemed completely in order. Certificate of arrival from Austria in 1959, processed through New York. Sponsored by a Catholic refugee organization. There were even two faded photographs, one showing a teenage boy who was recognizably his father, another showing an older woman who must have been his grandmother. David was about to close the file when something caught his eye. The birth certificate, an official-looking document with Austrian government seals, listed his father's birth date as March 7, 1945, in Vienna. But David had grown up hearing stories about how his father had been born in the chaos of the final weeks of the war, how his grandmother had gone into labor during an air raid. March 7th was 2 months before Germany surrendered. Vienna had still been under Nazi control, not yet fallen to the advancing Soviet forces. Perhaps his father had simply gotten the stories confused over the years, merging different memories. David almost convinced himself of this, almost put the papers away and forgot about the small discrepancy. But his academic training would not let him dismiss it so easily. He took out his phone and photographed the documents, telling himself he would probably never look at them again, that he was being paranoid. The following week, David started his new position at the Mansfield Center for International Studies, a prestigious think tank housed in a renovated townhouse in Georgetown. His supervisor, Dr. Patricia Holbrook, was a former CIA analyst who had spent 15 years working on Soviet counterintelligence before moving to the academic world. She was in her mid-50s, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to categorize and assess everything they observed. On his third day, David found himself working late, analyzing recently declassified documents about Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe during the 1950s. The documents detailed how Soviet intelligence had created false identities for their agents, elaborate backstories supported by forged documents designed to allow operatives to live in Western countries for years or even decades, building cover stories so deep that they became nearly undetectable. One particular case study caught his attention. A Soviet illegal named Rudolf Abel had operated in the United States from 1948 until his arrest in 1957, living as a photographer and artist while collecting intelligence. His background story claimed he was a refugee from German-occupied territory, and he had documents to prove it. The documents had been excellent forgeries, nearly perfect, but they had eventually been exposed because of small inconsistencies in his claimed biography, details that did not quite match the historical record. David read the passage 3 times, his father's face floating in his mind. He thought about the birth date that did not quite align with the story of being born during an air raid in the final days of the war. He thought about how vague his father had always been about specifics, how there were never any childhood friends from Austria who visited, no relatives who called at Christmas, no letters from the old country. He told himself he was being ridiculous. His father worked for the State Department, for God's sake. He had a security clearance. Background checks would have revealed any irregularities decades ago. The very idea that Walter Morrison could be anything other than what he claimed was absurd. But the thought would not leave him alone. That Friday evening, David joined some colleagues for drinks at a bar near DuPont Circle. Dr. Holbrook was there, relaxed and personable outside the office environment. After his second beer, emboldened by alcohol and unable to contain his unease any longer, David found himself describing the genealogy question, the small inconsistency in the dates, his growing but baseless concerns. Dr. Holbrook listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, swirling the ice in her glass. David immediately regretted saying anything, certain she would think him foolish, paranoid, or both. Instead, she said quietly, "How long has your father worked at State?" 18 years, David replied, "since 1960. And you said he immigrated in 59. Yes, Dr. Holbrook nodded slowly. Tomorrow is Saturday. Why don't you come to my office around 10 in the morning? Bring those photos you mentioned taking. I have some reference materials that might help you sort this out. Put your mind at ease." David barely slept that night. He kept telling himself there was nothing to worry about, that Dr. Holbrook was simply being thorough, that by noon the next day they would have confirmed his father's story, and David could laugh at his own paranoia. But another part of him, the part trained to see patterns and inconsistencies, kept circling back to the small details that did not fit. The next morning, David arrived at the Mansfield Center to find Dr. Holbrook already there, along with someone he had not expected. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Robert Chen of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. He was younger than David expected, maybe in his mid-30s, with an easy manner that did not quite mask the intensity of his gaze. Dr. Holbrook gestured for David to sit. "Before you panic," she said, "Agent Chen and I have worked together before on historical research projects. I called him last night, not because I think there is anything to worry about, but because if there is even a remote possibility that your concerns have merit, this is not something we should ignore. Can you show us the photographs you took?" David's hands trembled slightly as he pulled up the images on his phone. Agent Chen examined them closely, zooming in on the birth certificate, studying every detail of the document. Finally, he looked up. "This is going to sound like a strange question," he said, "but does your father have any unusual habits? Does he ever meet with people in unusual places? Does he take trips without clear explanations? Has he ever asked you or your sister about your studies or work in ways that seemed overly specific?" David felt his mouth go dry. "No," he said, "nothing like that. He is the most ordinary person imaginable. He goes to work, comes home, watches the evening news, tends his garden. The most exciting thing he does is his weekly chess game at the community center." "Who does he play chess with?" Agent Chen asked. David frowned, trying to remember. "Different people. There is a regular group there on Thursday evenings. I have never paid much attention." Dr. Holbrook leaned forward. "David, I am going to tell you something that does not leave this room. About 6 months ago, the agency received information from a source in Eastern Europe suggesting that there might be a long-term Soviet illegal operating at mid-level somewhere in the State Department. Someone who has been in place for many years, providing steady but not spectacular information. The kind of person who does not draw attention. We have been reviewing personnel files, but it is like looking for a needle in a haystack. There are hundreds of people it could be." David felt the room spin slightly. "You think my father is a Soviet spy? I think your father's background story has at least one inconsistency that warrants a closer look," Agent Chen said carefully. "That could mean anything. It could be a simple error in paperwork, a mistranslation, a clerical mistake made decades ago, or it could be something more serious. We need to verify. How? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We start by checking the details he gave you, Agent Chen said. Kirchberg is not a particularly unusual village name in Austria. There are actually several. We can contact Austrian records offices, see if there are any birth or marriage records matching the names and dates your father provided. If everything checks out, then we apologize for the inconvenience, and you can forget this conversation ever happened. And if it does not check out, David said, then we have more questions to ask, Agent Chen replied. The next 2 weeks were the longest of David's life. He went to work each day, came home to his apartment, and tried to act normally when he spoke to his parents on the phone. His mother called twice to chat about Thanksgiving plans. His father called once to ask if David had read the book on Soviet history yet, reminding him where to find it in the study. David listened to his father's voice, so familiar, so ordinary, and tried to imagine that voice speaking Russian, reporting intelligence to a handler, living a lie for decades. He could not make the images align. Agent Chen called on a Tuesday afternoon. We need to meet. Dr. Holbrook's office, 6 p.m. David cancelled his evening plans and drove to Georgetown with a sense of impending doom. When he arrived, he found Agent Chen and Dr. Holbrook, along with 2 other people, a woman introduced as Special Agent Sarah Martinez, also from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, and an older man named Thomas Brennan, who was identified only as a consultant from the agency. Agent Chen did not waste time on pleasantries. We contacted Austrian authorities and several refugee organizations. There is no record of a Helene Kohler from any village called Kirchberg marrying anyone with the surname Morrison or any German equivalent in Vienna in 1937. There is no record of a child born to a Helene Kohler or Helene Morrison in Vienna in March 1945. The Austrian documentation your father presented during his naturalization process in 1965 appears to be an excellent forgery, good enough to pass scrutiny at the time, but it does not hold up to modern verification methods. David sat down heavily. Oh, God. We ran some additional checks, Agent Martinez said, her voice gentler than Chen's. Your father's fingerprints are on file from his State Department security clearance. We ran them through some databases that were not available in 1965. They do not match anyone in Western records, which is not necessarily damning, but it is consistent with someone who never existed in Western Europe before appearing in the United States. What are you saying? David asked, though he already knew. We believe your father is most likely a Soviet illegal who entered the United States in 1959 under a false identity, Thomas Brennan said. He has spent the past 19 years building a life, a family, a cover story so deep that even the people closest to him have no idea who he really is. That is impossible, David said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. My mother would know. You cannot lie to someone for 20 years and have them not notice. Can you not? Dr. Holbrook said quietly. Your mother met your father in 1960, less than a year after he arrived in the country. He was a refugee with a tragic past, alone in America, learning English, looking for work. He would have seemed vulnerable, sympathetic. She fell in love with who he appeared to be. By the time they married, the cover story was already complete. She had no reason to question it. And us, David said. Amy and me. What are we? You are his children, Agent Martinez said firmly. Whatever else is true, that much is real. He raised you, loved you, gave you as normal a life as possible. That does not change. But he used us, David said bitterly. Our whole existence is part of his cover story. The perfect American family, making him look harmless and integrated. Probably, Agent Chen acknowledged, but that does not mean his feelings for you were not genuine. People are complicated, David. Even spies have families they care about. David put his head in his hands. What happens now? Now we need your help, Brennan said. We need to know what your father has been passing to his handlers, how he communicates with them, who else might be involved. We need to understand the full scope of his operation before we can shut it down. And we need to do this carefully, because if he realizes we are onto him, he will run, and we will lose the chance to learn what damage has been done. You want me to spy on my own father? David said. "We want you to help us protect national security," Agent Chen corrected. "Your father has been betraying this country for 2 decades. Whatever information he has passed along has potentially put American lives at risk, compromised operations, given the Soviets advantages they should not have. This is bigger than family loyalty, David." David looked up, his eyes red. "How am I supposed to do this? Just go home for Thanksgiving and snoop through his things? He will know something is wrong. He knows me too well." Dr. Holbrook spoke up. "You were already looking for that book he mentioned. You have a legitimate reason to be in his study. We are not asking you to do anything dramatic. Just observe, pay attention to his routines. Note if he has any unusual meetings or absences. Check if there are any hiding places in the house you never noticed before. We will guide you through it." David spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief and grief. He had lost his father, not to death, but to something worse. The revelation that the man he had known all his life was a fiction, a carefully constructed lie. Every childhood memory now seemed tainted, every word of advice questionable. Had his father steered him toward international relations as a career because it might someday be useful for intelligence gathering? Had the emphasis on language learning been about creating opportunities for travel to Eastern Europe? How much of his life had been shaped by the needs of a Soviet intelligence operation? The week before Thanksgiving, Agent Chen provided David with some specific things to look for. "There will likely be a concealment device somewhere in the house," he explained. "A hiding place for communications equipment, one-time pads, perhaps even a radio. It will be somewhere he can access easily but that others would not stumble upon. Check the basement, the garage, anywhere he spends time alone." Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear. David drove to his parents' house in Arlington, his stomach churning with anxiety. Amy was already there when he arrived, helping their mother in the kitchen, laughing at something Margaret had said. Walter was in the living room watching a football game with the sound turned low, reading glasses perched on his nose as he worked through a crossword puzzle. It was all so perfectly, painfully normal. "David," his father said warmly, standing to embrace him. "Good to see you, son. How is the new job treating you?" "It is incredible," David managed to say, returning the hug and trying not to think about the fact that he was embracing a man who might have caused the deaths of American intelligence officers. "I am learning so much." "That is excellent," Walter said. "You have a gift for this kind of work. Your analytical mind, your attention to detail, these will serve you well in your career." They ate dinner around the same table, where Amy's innocent question had started this nightmare. David watched his father carve the turkey with the same precise movements he used every year, listened to him tell the same familiar stories, observed the way he looked at Margaret with what appeared to be genuine affection. If this man was a spy, he was the best actor David had ever seen. After dinner, while Margaret and Amy were cleaning up in the kitchen, David excused himself to use the bathroom upstairs. Instead, he slipped into his father's study and closed the door quietly behind him. His heart hammered as he searched, trying to remember everything Agent Chen had told him about common concealment locations. The filing cabinet revealed nothing new. The desk drawers contained only the expected office supplies and papers. David was about to give up when his eye fell on the bookshelf. One section held his father's chess books, a collection of about 20 volumes ranging from beginner strategies to advanced game analysis. David pulled them out one by one, and behind the third book from the left, he felt something unexpected. A section of the wooden back of the bookshelf moved slightly under his touch. With trembling fingers, David pressed against the panel and felt it give way, revealing a shallow space perhaps 6 inches deep. Inside was a small wooden box, about the size of a cigar box. David lifted it out carefully, his breath coming in short gasps. The box was not locked. Inside, he found a small radio transmitter, compact and well-maintained. Beside it was a notepad filled with 5-digit number groups, a one-time pad for encoding messages, and beneath that, a single photograph. The photograph showed a much younger Walter, perhaps in his 20s, wearing what appeared to be a Soviet military uniform. Standing beside him was a woman around the same age, also in uniform. On the back, written in Cyrillic script, were names David could not read, and a date, 1953. David heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly replaced everything, pushing the panel back into place and shoving the books back onto the shelf. He had just seated himself at the desk, pretending to look at a book, when his father opened the door. "There you are," Walter said. "Your mother was wondering where you had gone. Are you feeling all right? You have been quiet all evening." David forced a smile. "Just tired from the week. The new job is demanding." Walter studied him for a moment, and David had the terrifying sensation that his father could see right through him, could read the knowledge written on his face. But then Walter simply nodded and said, "Do not work too hard, son. Balance is important in life." That night David called Agent Chen and described what he had found. The next morning, while his parents were at their regular Friday morning farmers market, FBI agents entered the house with a search warrant. They photographed everything in the concealment space, then replaced it exactly as they had found it. They also installed surveillance devices throughout the house, tiny cameras and microphones that would capture everything Walter said and did. David was not present for the installation. He could not bear to be there, to see his childhood home violated in this way, even though he knew it was necessary. Instead, he sat in Dr. Holbrook's office, drinking coffee and trying to process the reality of his situation. "Your father is likely what we call a sleeper agent," Brennan explained. "He was probably sent here in the 1950s with instructions to build a life, establish a cover, and work his way into a position where he could access valuable information. It might have taken him years just to get the State Department job. Once there, he would have been patient, never pushing for assignments beyond his apparent abilities, never drawing attention to himself. He would pass along low-level information, the kind of thing that seems innocuous but that, accumulated over time, gives the Soviets a better understanding of how American policy is formed." "So what now?" David asked. "You arrest him?" "Not yet," Agent Chen said. "We need to catch him in the act of espionage. We need to see who his handler is, understand the full network. If we arrest him now, we might miss other agents in his network. We need you to help us one more time." David closed his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" "Go back to your normal life," Agent Chen said. "Call your parents regularly. Visit for Christmas. Act like nothing has changed. Meanwhile, we will be watching and listening. Eventually, he will make contact with his handler, pass information, do something that we can document. When we have enough evidence, we will move in." The weeks that followed were surreal. David would sit in meetings at the Mansfield Center, analyzing Soviet policy, while knowing that his own father was a Soviet agent. He would call home on Sunday evenings, listening to his mother chat about her garden club, and his father discuss the latest news, all while FBI agents listened to every word through the surveillance devices in the house. In mid-December, the surveillance finally captured what the FBI had been waiting for. Walter had left the house on a Thursday evening, ostensibly for his weekly chess game at the community center. But instead of going to the center, he had driven to a shopping mall in McLean, parked his car, and walked to a nearby park. In the park, sitting on a bench in the cold December evening, he met with a man later identified as a Soviet cultural attaché with diplomatic immunity. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Walter handed over a manila envelope. The attaché handed back what appeared to be an identical envelope. They did not embrace, barely even spoke. To a casual observer, they might have been strangers who happened to sit on the same bench, but the surveillance photos captured everything, including the moment when they made the exchange. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, FBI agents arrested Walter Morrison as he was leaving for church with Margaret. David and Amy were not there. They had been asked to stay away, to wait for a phone call that would explain everything. That call came at 11 a.m. from Agent Chen. "We have your father in custody," he said. "Your mother is being questioned. She appears to have been genuinely unaware of his true identity. We are arranging for her to speak with you and Amy soon." David felt nothing. He had cried himself dry over the previous weeks, mourning the loss of the father he thought he knew. Now there was only a hollow ache where his family used to be. "What happens to him?" David asked. "That depends on whether he cooperates," Agent Chen said. "If he provides information about his network, about what he passed along all these years, he might receive a reduced sentence. If he refuses, he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. And us? What happens to Amy and me? You go on living your lives, Agent Chen said. You are not responsible for your father's choices. You are victims in this too. But that was easier said than done. When the news broke, it was a sensation. The press called Walter Morrison one of the most successful Soviet illegals ever caught on American soil. Journalists camped outside the family home, besieging Margaret with questions she could not answer. Amy withdrew from the University of Virginia, unable to face her classmates' stares and whispers. David kept working at the Mansfield Center, but the shadow of his father's betrayal hung over everything he did. The trial took place in late spring of 1979. Walter Morrison, whose real name was revealed to be Yuri Volkov, pleaded guilty to espionage charges in exchange for a 30-year sentence instead of life imprisonment. In court, he made a brief statement expressing regret for the pain he had caused his family, though he did not apologize for his actions as a spy. He said he had been serving his country and he had done his duty. David attended the trial but did not testify. He sat in the back of the courtroom, watching the man he had called father accept his sentence with the same calm dignity he had brought to every aspect of his fabricated American life. Their eyes met once, briefly, and David thought he saw genuine sorrow in his father's face, genuine pain at what he had lost. But he could not be sure. Perhaps that too was an act, one final performance. In the years that followed, David tried to rebuild his life. He continued working in international affairs, though he changed his focus from Soviet policy to other regions, unable to stomach the daily reminders of his father's betrayal. Amy eventually returned to university and completed her degree, though she changed her major to education, wanting nothing to do with international relations or politics. Margaret sold the house in Arlington and moved to North Carolina, seeking a fresh start where no one knew her story. The FBI's investigation into Walter Morrison, or Yuri Volkov, revealed that he had been passing information for nearly 20 years. Most of it was relatively low-level material, policy papers, internal State Department memos, assessments of American diplomatic strategies. Nothing earth-shattering, nothing that compromised critical operations. But accumulated over 2 decades, the information had given the Soviets valuable insights into American thinking and planning. The damage, while not catastrophic, was significant and lasting. David visited his father in prison exactly once, 3 years after the conviction. The decision to make the trip had not come easily. For months, the visitation request form had sat on his desk, unsigned, a white rectangle that represented all the complicated emotions he could not process. Part of him wanted answers, wanted to understand how a man could live such a complete lie for so many years. Another part of him wanted nothing more to do with the person who had used his entire family as cover for espionage activities that betrayed everything David had been raised to believe in. In the end, it was Amy who convinced him to go. She called him one evening from North Carolina, where she was living with their mother, and told him that closure was important, that unresolved questions had a way of poisoning the future. She had no intention of visiting their father herself, she said, but she thought David might need to for his own peace of mind. Amy had always been the more emotionally intuitive of the 2 siblings, better at understanding the messy feelings that David preferred to analyze from a distance. So David drove to the federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania, where Walter was serving his sentence, the journey taking nearly 4 hours through gray November landscapes. He signed in at the visitor's desk, submitted to a search, and was led through a series of locked doors that clanged shut behind him with a finality that made his chest tight. The visiting room was exactly as he had imagined it, sterile, institutional, divided into small tables where inmates and their visitors could sit across from each other, under the watchful eyes of guards stationed at intervals around the room. Walter appeared smaller than David remembered, diminished somehow by the prison uniform and the harsh fluorescent lighting. His hair had gone completely gray in the 3 years since his arrest, and new lines marked his face. But his eyes were the same, still sharp and assessing, still carrying that quality of focused intelligence that David had always associated with his father. They sat down across from each other, and for a long moment neither spoke. They talked for 30 minutes, discussing nothing of importance at first: the weather, David's work at the Mansfield Center, books Walter had been reading from the prison library. The conversation was stilted, formal, like strangers making small talk at a bus stop. Neither of them mentioned the trial, or the betrayal, or the shattered family that lay between them like broken glass. David found himself watching his father's hands as he spoke, hands that had taught him to tie his shoes and throw a baseball, and wondering how many documents those same hands had photographed for Soviet intelligence, how many secrets they had passed along. At one point, Walter asked about Amy, and David saw something flicker in his father's eyes that might have been genuine pain. "She is well," David said carefully. "She is teaching now, 2nd grade, in North Carolina. She is good at it. The children love her." "She always had patience," Walter said softly. "Even as a little girl, she would spend hours with puzzles, never getting frustrated when the pieces did not fit right away. I used to watch her and think she would make a wonderful teacher someday." The observation was so ordinary, so completely like something the father David had known would say, that for a moment David forgot where they were and why. Then reality reasserted itself, and the brief sense of connection vanished like smoke. When the time was up, David stood to leave, relieved that the ordeal was almost over. But as he pushed back his chair, Walter spoke again. "I am sorry," Walter said quietly, the first time he had spoken those words directly to his son. "Not for what I did for my country, but for the pain it caused you and your sister, for the lies. I loved you both. I hope you can believe that much." David looked at the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle, who had helped him with his homework, who had attended every school play and baseball game, who had been present for every important moment of his childhood, and yet had never really been there at all. The face looking back at him was familiar and strange at the same time, like a photograph slightly out of focus. "I do not know what I believe anymore," David said finally, his voice flat. "You taught me that actions speak louder than words. Your actions spoke pretty clearly. Everything else was just performance." "It was not all performance," Walter protested, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly. "You were my son. Amy was my daughter. Those were not lies." "Were they not?" David asked. "Because from where I stand, we were supporting characters in the story of Yuri Volkov's cover identity. We made you look trustworthy, American, safe. We were useful to your mission. That is what we were. Everything else is just what you tell yourself so you can sleep at night." Walter opened his mouth to respond, but David turned and walked away, signaling to the guard that he was ready to leave. He did not look back. As he passed through the series of locked doors, each one closing behind him with its heavy metallic clang, David felt something inside him close too, a final door shutting on the relationship that had once defined his life. He never went back. In 1985, as part of a prisoner exchange, Yuri Volkov was returned to the Soviet Union. He lived there until his death in 2003, never contacting his American family again. Whether he had another family in Russia, a life he had left behind when he was sent to America as a young man, David never learned. There were some questions, he decided, that were better left unanswered. The Morrison case became a textbook example in counterintelligence training. A perfect illustration of how deep cover agents operate and how difficult they are to detect. David himself was occasionally asked to speak about his experience, though he usually declined. He had no interest in being forever defined by his father's crimes, in being the son of a Soviet spy rather than his own person. But the experience changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He learned that people are capable of extraordinary deception, that the faces we present to the world may bear no relationship to who we truly are. He learned that love and betrayal can coexist, that someone can genuinely care for you while simultaneously using you. And he learned that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in truth, the fabrications so carefully constructed that they become more real than reality itself. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, declassified documents revealed more details about Yuri Volkov's operation. He had been trained in Moscow from the age of 18 specifically for the deep cover assignment. He had studied English and American culture for years before being sent to the West. The entire Austrian refugee story had been created by Soviet intelligence, complete with forged documents and a carefully researched background that would be almost impossible to verify. What the documents did not reveal, And what David would never know was whether Yuri Volkov had ever regretted his mission. Whether he had lain awake at night, listening to his wife breathe beside him, wondering what his life might have been if he had actually been the person he pretended to be. Whether he had watched his children grow and felt genuine pride, untainted by the knowledge that they were props in his cover story. Whether in the end the man had been consumed by the mask, or if somewhere beneath it all, Yuri Volkov still existed, separate from Walter Morrison. The photograph David had found in the concealment space, showing a young Soviet officer in uniform, remained in FBI custody as evidence. David never asked to see it again. He preferred to remember his father as he had known him, as Walter Morrison, the Austrian refugee who loved pot roast and crossword puzzles and had never missed one of his son's baseball games. It was a fiction, but it was the fiction he had grown up with, and in some strange way it felt more true than the reality of Yuri Volkov, Soviet illegal, a man David had never known and never would. Amy got married in 1983 to a high school teacher from North Carolina. She invited David to the wedding but did not invite their father, even though he was alive and in prison. Neither of them spoke his name that day. Margaret cried during the ceremony, but whether from joy at seeing her daughter married or grief for the family they had lost, David could not say. Perhaps it was both. David himself married a few years later, a lawyer named Catherine who knew his history but loved him anyway. They had 2 children, and David vowed to himself that he would be the kind of father his children could trust completely, whose every word and action came from a place of honesty. He told them his own father's story when they were old enough to understand, wanting them to know the truth, but also to know that they were not defined by it. The Cold War ended, walls fell, empires crumbled. The great ideological struggle that had defined the 20th century faded into history. But for David Morrison, the war had never really ended. It lived on in the complicated grief of knowing that the foundation of his childhood had been built on sand, in the learned wariness that made it hard to trust completely, in the understanding that certainty is an illusion, and that the people we think we know best may be strangers wearing familiar faces. On quiet evenings sometimes, he would think about that Sunday dinner in 1978, about Amy's innocent question regarding their grandmother's maiden name. Such a small thing, such a casual query, and yet it had been enough to pull at a loose thread, to begin the unraveling of a lie 2 decades in the making. He wondered what would have happened if Amy had never taken that genealogy class, if she had never asked that question. Would they have lived their entire lives never knowing? Would ignorance have been kinder? But then he would look at his own children, at the trust in their eyes when they asked him questions, and he would think that perhaps truth, no matter how painful, was preferable to the alternative. That perhaps the most important thing he could give them was the certainty that when he spoke, he meant what he said, that there were no hidden agendas, no secret identities, no carefully crafted lies beneath the surface of their family life. The Yuri Volkov case remained classified in many of its details for decades, though over time more information emerged. Other members of his network were eventually identified, some caught, some already gone back to Russia. The full extent of the intelligence compromise was assessed and found to be significant, but not catastrophic. Life went on, as it always does, and the Morrison family became a footnote in the history of Cold War espionage, a cautionary tale told in counterintelligence training sessions. But for the people who lived through it, for David and Amy and Margaret, it was not history. It was the permanent reshaping of their understanding of their own lives, the knowledge that their memories were unreliable because the person at the center of them had not been real. They learned to live with this knowledge, to build new lives on more honest foundations, but they never forgot. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.